Well, welcome everyone to our engineering webinar. This is a special edition of our monthly webinar that we hold each month, and we thought we would do this because of some issues that have come up and situations concerning cybersecurity. It seems that the availability and the activity around this is sort of increasing in all areas, but especially in broadcasting. There's been a number of situations around the country where stations have been hacked, their RDSs or their audio streams or their EAS. And so we want to take a look at that today and see how that's working, how they get into it, and what we can do as a broadcast station. And very timely, we scheduled this program with our guest speaker a few weeks ago, and just last week, I guess it was, the FCC came out with they're going to vote at the end of this month, I think, on adopting a proposed rulemaking that's going to mandate, and I use that word, mandate, some cybersecurity issues and how to avoid them. And we'll talk about those as we go along. One thing I looked briefly or tried to go through there, the actual document, and it's rather long, so I didn't have time to sit down and read all of it, but I didn't see anything in there where they said they were going to enforce it, meaning fines but I know that the way the commission operates, somewhere down the road, if people fail to implement some of the things that the commission is talking about, that NOVs may be issued, notice of violations, if you don't adhere to that. So in order to get us up to speed on how all this works and learn more about it. We all have a good friend, most of you know, Wayne Pecena, who is the IT director for Texas A&M and also the technical supervisor or the engineer, I guess, Wayne, for the campus radio station out there. Wayne Pecena. Wayne, thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank Larry. Certainly, it's my pleasure to join you today.
Yeah, let's talk about cybersecurity sort of in general, what it actually is, and sort of bring us up to speed on what's happening in the industry today.
Well, certainly as broadcasters, in a lot of ways, if you go back a few years, we sort of lived in our own world of even back to analog audio days or analog video days for the TV stations. And as a result, that kind of isolated or that siloed technical environment, we lived pretty simple and pretty happy. But then the technology move came along where we began migrating that infrastructure to IT infrastructure, and IP, or the Internet Protocol, became the method of interconnecting the different boxes. So if you think about your rack room, your technical operations center, maybe a small station, it's one rack of equipment that is that infrastructure of the station. It has kind of moved from what was often a collection of different manufacturers' dedicated boxes that were performing a certain broadcast function, whether it was an audio processor, uh, maybe, of course, an EAS encoder, decoder, an automation system, whatever. Now that infrastructure is, if you look at that rack, it is often a rack of computers and all interconnected over IP. So as a result, that transformation into the IP world has brought out a lot of advantages, But often the part that's not talked about is some of the disadvantages or the responsibilities that comes with that of opening the door to cyber attacks on that infrastructure.
And there's a lot of areas now in the broadcast facility, not just EAS. That's one of the majors, I'm sure. But now people have STL, studio to transmitter links that's fed over the most of the time over public internet. They're not on a private fiber feed or anything. So bu- multiple areas that somebody that wants to do I guess we could say do harm or just try to get into something.
Yeah.
There are many doors they can use to get into your broadcast system.
Yeah, that's right. The STL is a good point uh, because, again, going back, an STL pretty much was let's say, a 900 megahertz radio system. And of course, being from the Central Texas area, everybody had a Marty unit, not for the remote pickup, but for the STL. And that kind of was the normal way to do that. And of course, now you may have Ethernet radios, you may have simply using the public internet as the connection medium between your studio and your transmitter. Uh, in a lot of ways, a pretty low cost way to do that. But that comes once again with some responsibilities to protect that link from some type of intrusion.
With all these problem areas that can happen, most or a lot of stations, I get the big ones have IT personnel there sort of looking after the stuff, but there are still a lot of smaller stations, especially in radio, that don't have that luxury of having an IT department that can sort of keep an eye on things like that. But even if you did have an IT, people could still get into it, even if you had a dedicated staff. But to the stations that don't have the luxury of having that type of personnel, that really puts a little burden on them on how to protect themselves.
It does. It truly does. And again, I think it puts a burden on a lot of people involved. For instance, that small station, or I often use the term the mom and pop station. Most likely, they don't have a full-time chief engineer. They rely on a contract engineer for really all of their technical support. And with that, from the contract engineer's perspective, I think the importance or the significance of the IT is going to become, let's say, a new task on their plate. And maybe they already have that, but at the same time, maybe they don't. So again, I think, a potential burden and a new level of responsibility really on everyone involved, from that station owner to maybe the contract engineer that is providing all of the technical support for that station, and even taking it down to the individual employees of the station. Because one of the areas, you can spend a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of resources on cybersecurity, but social engineering can often very, very quickly kind of disrupt all of that. And the key there is particularly for employees to recognize, like, social engineering, phishing attempts, and sort of thing, which is often the entry point for ransomware in the stations.
I think I'm glad you mentioned that because that's an area I think that a lot of people don't think about. You can have all the fancy equipment, but if an employee happens to get onto the wrong site, then stuff can come right in. I know the major corporations, Alhard and Cumulus, just to mention a couple of them, their their corporation watches that pretty close. And I've had engineers at some of the group-owned stations saying that they'll actually issue a warning to an employee if or they will take an app off of an employee's computer overnight. You come in the morning and an app you had is gone because the corporation found that, and it was a so-called backdoor into their systems. So the larger groups like that look after that, I think.
Well, one of the
Yeah, and
easiest way too is getting into through emails. I mean, there are a lot of phishing emails out there, as Wayne um, uh, mentioned a moment ago, and that's been a big problem because there have been several large companies in the past few years, not as recent, but they were hit with ransomware, and it's really hard. They do a lot of testing at these companies, but again, with the small mom and pops, there was a case a few years back. AM FM combo got hit along with a number of people in a local community. The local IT company had access to various businesses there to assist with problems, and somebody breached the IT company and was able to get to the radio station as well as other businesses. And there was no way, to protect themselves, unfortunately, because that link was open all the time.
Yeah, that may be the situation too and we talked about this before we actually went to started the program, was that some of the equipment, especially transmitters, the manufacturers, in order to help you troubleshoot, have access to some of the equipment at your facility. And there was a case, I think, which I mentioned earlier, somebody got into a transmitter, and what they did was actually got in through the port that was set up for the manufacturer to get into, and got into their RDS and changed all the messages going out on the RTS, and they were not very friendly messages. And unfortunately, of course, it would be unfortunate to anybody, but this was a Christian station, and the things that were going out over the RDS was really, really bad. So, no, you just can't have ports available, or you need to have, as they say in the audio business, less is more. So the less ways you have of people getting into your system, uh, that's the best thing.
Yeah, well, this was just mentioned by Nathan Miller. It says, "Isn't that why the FCC recommends separate networks, broadcasting business?" I'm not sure the commission's really ever specified, but that's just good IT practice. I've walked into a lot of facilities, and I mean large facilities, that they're under one common IP protocol. And, personally, if I'm involved in one, I want a office subnet, I want a engineering subnet, I want a audio console subnet, an automation subnet, and then a production subnet because it's too easy when you don't have absolute control and nobody has absolute control that you want to try to prevent anybody from getting in. And the only way you can do that if they breach one area is hopefully you have enough subnets to keep them from another area.
Yeah, that key of using segmented networks, I think, is pretty much essential to do, and I'm going to assume we'll see that in that FCC proposed rulemaking because they've made, at least in the document that I've read, a casual mention of segmented network. Firewalls, segmented networks. So, uh, but you're right, that is a common uh, let's call it cyber hygiene practice, is you begin with the proper design of the network and a segmented or layered, whatever term you prefer to apply, is really the key there so that you minimize any attack surface. So if there is a breach, then that breach is somewhat isolated as opposed to having access to the kingdom, so to speak.
And I guess VPNs fall into that same area.
Oh, definitely.
Well, certainly, yeah, I think of VPN anytime, of course, one of the advantages that the IT or IP infrastructure has is for remote access. And that remote access is, I think important to stations large and small to be able to quickly, say, take care of a problem without driving to the station. Or if you're a multiple operator, that station may be across the country. But anytime you enable any type of remote access, you need to encrypt it. And that's where I think the VPN comes in. But even to create a segmented network in that small, let's say a small mom and pop radio station, utilizing VLANs, in other words, individual virtual local area networks across a common, physical network infrastructure is really that's pretty simple to do. And that really is a key to creating that said segmented network.
Wayne, what do you think of some of the services that I know a lot of us use, such as LogMeIn? Let's see, SplashTop, I think, is another one, if I'm remembering it correctly. Obviously, there are a lot of costs, there are securities involved, but what has been your experience with those?
Well, certainly, I think, if you are going to enable or provide remote access, you need a mechanism to do that. And there are many ways in which to do that. Uh, each probably has their advantages and also the disadvantages. I would say often the more secure ways are probably going to come with more cost associated with them. But those are considerations you take into play when you choose that access mechanism. Some might say, well, Windows has a remote desktop. I'll just use that one, which is a viable solution, but also Windows Remote Desktop is probably one of the most targeted uh, potential access points there is. So, again, there's always a trade-off that comes into play.
Yeah, when we talked before the program started about who are these people that are trying to get into your system, and what are they wanting to do? And I think you were a part of a seminar a while back, and you had some slides that talked about who these people are and what their intents are and how they actually do that. If you want to be nice, if you want to show a few of those slides and talk about those, would be good.
Okay, we certainly can do that. Let me bring up those slides. All right, this should be coming up momentarily. Larry mentioned I was part of a workshop that the Federal Communications Commission did back last month. Actually, it was on May 14th. And I was part of that workshop and did a presentation. So these slides are not the full presentation, but some selected ones. So one of the questions, well, who is the threat actor that's out there potentially to target? And quite honestly, there could be a pretty diverse group of threat actors out there, beginning, of course, with some nation states got cyber warfare. For the most part, I'm going to assume that you're not going to be faced with that sort of adversary that's out there. Most likely, and this is strictly my opinion, you're going to be a target of a criminal hacker, which generally is out to extort money. That is their motivation, or the hacktivists. And the hacktivist is pretty broad category as well, but they have some kind of grudge against your station, or they want to disrupt your operations or so forth. But there again can be several different types. We have this, what I'll call the media image of a hacker. It's always, someone in a dark room in front of a green screen terminal. Of course, got to be wearing a hoodie. Uh, that is, out to do harm to you. But also, you can have what is sometimes described as the script kiddie, which is someone they're not really necessarily out to do harm. Their challenge is to access a system or access something that they should not have access to, is kind of the chart, their challenge and so forth. The reality is that you're not really faced with, again, the guy sitting in front of the green screen terminal or even the script kiddie. What you have is applications that are being executed in a data center environment that are constantly basically crawling or scanning the public internet looking for potential targets. And we could show an example of one of those here shortly. But again, there can be a wide variety of, even your competition. Uh, if you do have some type of information that has value, maybe the threat actor is a data broker that's generally out to, quote, steal that information. Most broadcast stations probably are not dealing with online uh, e-commerce, so you have a lot of credit card numbers. That's generally where that comes into play. But you can have, disgruntled employees. In fact, here is one ad that was on LinkedIn earlier this year, basically looking for someone, again, internally within a company to share in the potential proceeds and so forth. So again, there could be a lot of, I guess, potential threat actors out there.
So they just come in all shapes and sizes, and like you say, a lot of them are not looking to do harm. A lot of them, I think, or maybe the vast majority of them, are there just to see if they can do it.
Well, certainly that I think fits the motivation of what is described as the script kiddie. Uh, the challenge is there is, again, it's like someone that picks locks as a hobby. They're not out to break in. The challenge is to open that lock that I shouldn't have access to. So the kind of the same thing into computer networks and so forth. But again, that hacktivist is more likely the culprit, I think, particularly for small stations, unless there's potential money to be extorted. And if
It's
you look at some of the past events, if you go back, gosh, in the trade publications, virtually every major broadcast group has had some type of major cybersecurity event that has occurred. And those pretty much are all, the motivation is to extort money because ransomware has been involved. Uh, what you don't see in the trade publications is all the small stations or the mom and pop stations and so forth that have had issues, and that could again be a wide range of threat actors that are there. And you've mentioned, several of those, whether it is the inappropriate RDS data being broadcast, the replacement, of hacking into an audio path through an STL and changing the format, so to speak, of a station, and are, generating false EAS tones, uh, or false EAS even events more than just the tones, you know, we've seen over time.
Yeah, I mentioned we actually had a situation here in Alabama where I had a call from a station down in the southern part of the state that said he had a problem with his EAS system, in that every morning during their live morning show, it would start randomly just running weird tests and alerts from like Ohio and Nevada and just all over the place. And it was just interrupting his program. And he said, "What can I do?" I said, "Well, I think initially go back and bypass the unit, just unplug the in and out cables from your unit and plug them together till we can look into it and see." And I actually went down to the station and tried to get into the unit, and I got a warning back from the unit that I was not authorized to access this device. And after trying to figure it out and getting with the manufacturer of the device, they said, "Oh, that device has been hacked." And we actually found out that somebody had gotten into it and created a whitelist and blocked out entry to it from anybody, and had randomly scheduled, and they apparently had some knowledge about broadcast because they were doing this during their popular live morning show and interrupting. So we were able to do a cold reboot and dump all the memory out and reprogram it. And as I told you before the program started, I asked the people there how they access the device. I said, "What was your username and password you were using?" They said, "Oh, it was admin." I said, "Oh, okay." So that was the situation. And that being said, and we'll continue on the same topic here. One of the things the FCC in their proposed rulemaking is, and I noted this because you and I talked about this, to have a minimum of 15 characters in your password. Most people just have just a few, and a lot of them have like their radio station call letters or their frequency. And that's talk about that a little bit because you're familiar with how that works.
Yeah, I think it's common. You will see the term always use a strong password, and that's going to apply whether that's to your bank account, to your Amazon account, whatever it may be. But what really is a strong password? You'll probably find many different definitions of that, but the National Institute of Standards and Technology, they have some termina or some definitions for a strong password, and generally that is that 15 or 16 character, which is a mixture of numeric characters, alphanumeric characters, upper and lower cases, different characters, and but not in anything that would be a dictionary word, because once again, who is the threat actor? Well, it's an application being executed in a data center, and utilizing dictionary words, that's pretty easy to scan, and just hit and miss, try. That admin, that's probably the first thing that gets tried when a potential target is discovered. So uh, again, that mixture. And often you'll run into the term of using a passphrase, which is some type of statement that means something to you, but then you transpose letters or numerals, certain parts, using uppercase and lowercase, that sort of thing. So it is somewhat of a uh, I'm going to call it a random sequence, but it's also something you can remember, because another big mistake a lot of people make is you use the same password for multiple sites. And that has shown to be a real weak point in cybersecurity, is utilizing that same password throughout multiple sites.
We've seen a lot of, and I was thinking about while you were talking about that, and I think most people have probably seen the movie War Games, and that was one of the things that every time I think about cybersecurity, I think about that movie War Games, where the kid had a way of just dialing random phone numbers, and it would answer. And if you got if back in the old days, if you got like a tone back, you hit one, and then it would go
Yep.
through and try to find a password, and you were talking about doing the random, trying to figure out what the password was. Those of you who have watched that movie know at the end where they the computer was trying to launch the missiles, and it was going through random numbers and letters, and it only had like 7 digits in there, I think. And it was randomly scanning through them. And when it found one that seemed to fit, it would lock onto it. So nowadays, and we can talk about AI as well in this conversation, but with that technology, that's very easy for a potential hacker, if they're running some sort of application that uses AI to go through and find and figure out what that password is.
That's very true. Again, the dictionary type, again, that's why you want to stay away from dictionary words and certainly default. They are libraries of default login credentials for all kinds of equipment that exist out there. And it's really not that big of a technical challenge to, once a host is found, you just try to log into it. And that's not necessarily that human sitting there in front of a computer or the green screen doing that. That's an application running in a data center environment that is automating that. And of course, you mentioned AI. AI has sort of opened the door to even further what I'll call enhanced threat generation. Certainly, AI has its place in prevention, but at the same time, AI has its place in creation of potential threats.
Yeah. Wayne, let's talk a little bit about security of passwords. I've walked into broadcast facilities before, and on the wall in the engineer's office, they'd have all the passwords listed. And I know we were talking beforehand, before we started the seminar, about some of the programs that supposedly are secure and keeping your passwords. I'd like you to comment a little bit on that, if you would.
Well, one of the first place you look for a password, no, you pick up the keyboard and it's on the bottom. It's a sticky note on the bottom of the keyboard to the particular device. Uh, that is a challenge with passwords. Is you want something that is unique. At the same time, you want something that you can remember what it is. Or you have, of course, your little, I'll call it little black book of where you keep everything scribbled down. But that is a challenge. That's where password managers come into play to be useful, particularly in a environment where you may have multiple people need access to that same equipment. And rarely do you see any broadcast equipment that allow multiple accounts. So each individual user has a unique, account. So that can be a challenge to manage that sort of thing. I think most commonplace is probably a. I'm going to use a example of a spreadsheet that, okay, I'll put a login to the spreadsheet that I've got all that shared information for a facility in it. And you sort of keep that one pretty close to you, so to speak.
You could do like Kirk Harnack just posted a while ago. He said he lost his password and he used his dog's name. So now I guess it's Brownie.
Well, that is one of the kind of goes back to utilizing what is considered a dictionary word. You know, a IT system that is managing the passwords, they should disallow things like dictionary words. And you would find that in a lot of what I would think of as server type applications with the cybersecurity protections. But you take again, I don't want to pick on any particular manufacturer, but a typical broadcast device probably is only going to require a 8 character password. It's not going to have the intelligence to do dictionary searches. It can be pretty much whatever you want it to be. So you have to kind of inject that intelligence, into that.
Well, going forward, with all the stuff that's being connected to the IT network, um, and we were talking earlier about the way AI works. Is AI something that is going to be able to help people with cybersecurity, or is it going to be something that's going to be dangerous to cybersecurity?
Well, I think it can be some of both, quite honestly. From one standpoint, certainly the AI is will have certainly an application in the cybersecurity defense side of things. In other words, it's going to enable a lot better real-time detection of a potential threat, automate the response process to that, or even just seeking out potential threats. But AI also has just as strong a use in the creation of threats. So there's, I think, one of those maybe a certain amount of cat and mouse going on between a threat actor and also defending against threats, both utilizing UI, AI.
Wayne, could you possibly give us a rundown of what you would feel like is for that would work for both a mom and pop station and on up into larger stations that may not have full-time IT departments? What you would consider would be the ideal setup to prevent any type of intrusion into a network as far as equipment, components, that kind of thing? Because I'm sure we probably have some people here that aren't well versed in IT, and some trying to learn. So I think that would be a handy thing to have.
Well, certainly, I think that the you have to start with really you want the right network design. And I think earlier, briefly mentioned a segmented network or a layered network. That's really the starting place. Now, how many layers, how many segments, that's really involving individual stations. But, your example of the business network, maybe the public Wi-Fi network, the broadcast control network, maybe the core, what I'd call audio path. Those are, potential segments so that if a breach occurs, you limit the reach of that breach. Certainly with that proper network design, then you implement things such as utilizing encryption anytime external connections are made. For instance, say the STL path, whether that's done over a uh, Ethernet radio or over the public internet, is encrypt that. Uh, when you're doing remote access, which most likely uh, you're going to want that remote access. That also needs to be encrypted through a VPN type situation. And then you need to think about a how I guess I'll call it the housekeeping. In other words, cybersecurity is not one of those things you install it, you're done with it, you go on to the next thing. There's routine housekeeping to be done of keeping up with equipment patches, equipment updates, uh, doing things such as minimizing or disabling services that may be turned on by default that you really don't need or don't use, will disable that because, again, there's a potential, uh, could be a potential access point to your infrastructure. And a key is monitoring things, sort of know what is normal. And often, when there are cyber events that occur, uh, there's some signs oftenly of unique activity, high levels of utilization of resources, that sort of things. There could be a cyber event occurring that you don't know about.
The commission actually mentioned in their notes concerning the proposed rulemaking something that I think is extremely important, and I find stations are not adhering to, and that is keeping and you mentioned about it briefly, but keeping the software or firmware in your devices up to date with the appropriate patches and everything. And because a lot of the manufacturers, when they issue new updates, they include things that will be helpful in warding off some sort of entry into their equipment. So it's extremely important. And I was happy to see that the commission had mentioned that in their report and order that that's going to be something that's mandatory. And I think that that's going to really get some stations off the stool to make sure that their equipment is up to date software wise. Talk about the importance of that a little bit.
Well, certainly, virtually, I think it's probably safe to say that any IT device out there has some potential vulnerability to it, and those are discovered. One resource that is available is the known exploitable vulnerability catalog that comes from CISA, or the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. And there's probably a listing of, I'm going to say, 1,500 plus potential vulnerabilities that are out there, that exist, of known vulnerabilities. And the key to fixing most of those vulnerabilities is a software patch. So that's why I think it is important for the users to routinely update when a manufacturer lists, releases some new firmware or new software, is to keep that stuff update, because what they're doing is they are fixing, a vulnerability that has been discovered, and that ranges all the way from whoever the operating system creator is, and we'll pick on Microsoft here. They're famous for every Tuesday with those, updates. Some of those are more critical than others to, individual pieces of equipment to keep that software patched, which is, again, taking care of that known or discovered vulnerabilities that exist.
What happens, and let's just take a scenario, if a station does find that they have been hacked, uh, either not necessarily ransomware, but somebody just gotten into the system, how do you go back effectively correcting that or eliminating that?
Well, that is a pretty broad question that it kind of depends on the specifics. Let's take ransomware for instance. A lot of times, the key to recovering from a ransomware attack is having a legitimate backup of the, let's say, that software, whatever it might be. Uh, because a typical ransomware event is going to, let's say, encrypt a hard disk, and use the example maybe your automation system, which has all your content on it, and they're going to encrypt that, and they're going to want money to get that back. So how do you recover from that? Well, the key is having a backup to it, or I guess you pay the ransom and hope you're dealing with a legitimate threat actor that really can recover what they've encrypted. But you need to have again, a backup. In a lot of cases, you start all over. And many companies that have experienced ransomware attacks, they don't just reformat, let's say, that hard drive and recover a backup. They basically scrap the whole hardware platform and start all over because they don't trust what even could be hidden in that. But in most cases, having that legitimate backup. But think about what that entails. That entails primarily time. And again, that small station, you're quote off the air potentially, at least off the air in terms of utilizing your automation till you can recover that, and assuming you had viable backups.
The use of cloud is storage now, and huge data centers is just exploded almost. It's everywhere. I know here in Montgomery, they're building just a massive, massive building, and it was right across the street, right across the highway from the Hyundai plant, which is a huge facility. And when I saw it being built, I thought it was an expansion of the Hyundai plant. I later found out it's a massive data center. The use of the cloud with the big data centers, is that a plus in that they probably do a good job of watching out for attacks like that, or is it a negative?
Well, I think that can be, if you think about a data center, and data centers often offer many different services uh, that they provide, and certainly utilizing a data center for uh, data backup for an entity certainly is a viable solution. Maybe cost effective, maybe not. But in the restoration process, you often have to think about the time that it takes, and that's what becomes a challenge for a lot of companies, particularly if we're dealing with a lot of data. But most of the cloud service providers, they're providing redundancy within that data center environment, or redundancy even between data centers. So that generally is a pretty reliable place to store information. You just have to be careful and look very carefully at their service level agreements and the provisions of how they bill things. For instance, a lot of them make it very cheap to upload information and make it somewhat more expensive to download information. So, and also there's a time factor involved. So many considerations that come into play, but a very popular way in which to uh, do data backup.
Yeah, several years ago, I had the opportunity to tour a big data center in Atlanta. And it was amazing to me that they had, like you said, several different levels of service. You could have, and this particular data center was hosting a lot of business uh, facilities like Sears and Roebuck, or stores and stuff that way. That's where their stuff was stored. they had levels of service where they would just rent you a space and you could put your equipment in there and that
Right.
was it. Then they had other levels where they would handle all the hardware and look after it. And then their top level, and if you went in their master control room, it looked like the Starship Enterprise. It was a massive thing. And they looked after everything. And quite often the guy told me that they would see a trouble or maybe an intrusion from the outside. They would see something and they could correct it without the customer even knowing. So that was rather impressive, but obviously that's an expensive way to go. But if you're looking for maximum protection and taking the burden off the local staff, I guess is what I'm going at. That might be a
Yeah.
way that you can do that if that could fit into your budget. But we all know that most of the stations that we deal with, and John goes around and sees a lot of the small ones like I do, that's not in their budget.
Right.
And even backup is not in their budget. So it becomes a real dilemma. And I applaud, again, I applaud the FCC for stepping up and wanting to well, I don't know whether it's a help or not, but at least put some guidance for stations on things. And I think the three top things that I saw, and you might want to talk about this, one was actually having proper firewall protection, and I think the second was a uh, a secure password on all the equipment, and the third, which we've already talked about, was the making sure that you do all the software patches. And I hope that sort of gets passed and gets because there's a lot of vulnerability out there to these stations, especially the smaller stations, to protect themselves.
That's true. Unfortunately, we're well past the days of where there was one thing. I mean, in the past, at some point in time, all we really had to do was have a firewall, and that was considered a secure network environment. And we're well past that now. We're really, you have to think about multiple layers of protection. Certainly, a firewall is an important a part of that layered structure. But we've already mentioned having that segmented network, having a that routine of the cyber housekeeping task. Well, for instance, take the firewall. You need to update the signature file on that firewall on a regular basis. And when we talk about firewalls in itself can become a pretty broad topic. If you go back to the origin or the original firewall, they were simply a packet filter. They would simply look at the header of an IP packet and make a decision. I'm going to permit this packet or I'm going to deny that packet based upon a source or destination address. Never looked at the payload. Well, today we certainly have many different names, but next generation firewall or deep packet inspection firewalls, where they actually look at contents of that packet uh, payload information and make decisions of that. And you'll find intrusion detection systems or intrusion prevention systems that are doing that inspection of basically information either flowing into a network or flowing out of it is resolved. So again, it can be a pretty broad, I think, topic in that regard.
Well, when a
And
station starts looking at that and they decide that's what they need to do, what are the what are the features of a firewall if some station is, and again, we're talking about small stations here, if they wanted to do some protection, what do they need to look for? I mean, they don't have anybody that knows how to program it. And can you buy an off the shelf? Or, of course, and now I think there's a lot of software versions of firewalls. What is the one that Windows uses? Windows Defender or whatever it's called. They claim that's a firewall of some sort. Are those effective, or what would a station? How would they know how to do that?
Well, that's where I think there has to be some expertise. It's like when you're hiring that contract engineer for that small radio station, they sort of need to know some fundamentals. Now, maybe that's not their maybe that's their second job, but there's some fundamentals you sort of have to know how a transmitter works or the principles, and kind of the same thing I think in the IAT world of having some of the basics that is out there. In the we'd mentioned the FCC workshop. Uh, the examples that I use there are was geared toward the small station. In other words, that was sort of the target of the presentation. And my goal was to use products that were under $500. And there are several legitimate firewall devices that are out there. At the same time, you mentioned software. You can make your own firewall either using commercial software or even open source software that you deploy on a appropriate hardware platform. That might be even as something simple as a Raspberry Pi to uh, build your own. But to do that, that does take a certain amount of technical expertise. I'm going to say you got to put your geek hat on if you're going to go, build your own firewall, so to speak. But certainly, if you have that capability or expertise, certainly that can be done.
Wayne, we had a question from Ray Lewis. He said, "What do you think of OpenSense or PFSense, both open source hardware firewalls? Also heard good things about Ubiquity Firewall. I don't want to put you on the spot for brands, but hey, it's worth a question."
Well, Ubiquity is an easy one. That's what I use at home.
Well,
Um,
that's what I use at home.
and have deployed Ubiquity stuff for different environments. I put on my Texas A&M hat, and I'm going to use Cisco products. That's just the way things are at. But there's you know, a lot of products that are out there. Firewalla is another, I think, again, relatively low cost devices that are out there that are, reasonably respectable uh, products. Now, they do require, as you've probably experienced with your Ubiquity, it's not going to be plug and play to set that up. You do have to do some configuration, generate those firewall rules and so forth. Because generally, a firewall right out of the box is going to what? It's going to deny everything. It's not going to permit anything, and you have to at least create rules that will allow to permit certain things. But utilizing PF Sense, again, you can quote buy commercial products that have implemented PF Sense in them, or you can pretty much roll your own, so to speak, literally using something like a Raspberry Pi as the hardware platform. Kind of goes back to what is the kind of throughput you need for your network infrastructure.
Wayne, what do you have any experience with, or have any knowledge about how effective the firewalls that claim to be used by ISPs, by the cable companies and all, where you get your internet? They as a selling feature, they say, "Oh, we have built-in firewall protection." Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think if you look at an ISP, certainly they are some what I will call protections that they should be implementing that are pretty much well known. They're, but at the same time, a ISP firewall is going to be relatively open because they're going to rely on the end user to really uh, protect because they're wanting to sell services to a wide range of customers. But they are certainly, if you're operating an ISP, there's some accepted things. You're going to block certain even IP address ranges. Certainly some type of protocols. There's some, I'll call it good housekeeping as a legitimate ISP that you're going to implement. And a lot of times they will use a next generation type firewall that is doing some type of packet inspection. How extensive or how deep that might go is going to vary. But I think by just the nature of the ISP business, you're going to operate a relatively open from a firewall standpoint.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Well, I guess to sum it all up, it's not going away. Cybersecurity is not going away. As the commission says, it seems to be on the increase, and I think that's the reason that they've implemented this proposed rulemaking to at least help stations move up a step or two in their protection. So that I think all stations should need to take this seriously and not just say, "Oh, it's another requirement from the commission."
Yes, I think in one sense, I think they're putting a little meat behind maybe some common sense things that you should be doing. Will we see notice of violations issued over cybersecurity things? I certainly don't have a crystal ball to predict that. It wouldn't surprise me to see that at some point down the road. And at the same time, of course, you and John both are doing inspections at stations. When is cybersecurity type, I'll call it provisions, going to become a part of that inspection program that you're doing with stations?
That's a good thought. I hadn't thought about that, and I'm sure John probably hadn't thought about it either.
Well, if the FCC is going to create new rules regarding that, then that's going to be a natural part of your inspection. Or I guess we could put that off on the SBE. They're going to have to revise their inspection guidelines
Yeah.
here to reflect, the cybersecurity provisions that are out there.
Wow, that will be something. I would do that. Well, Wayne, I appreciate your time today. It's been very informative, and I don't think we can stress enough how important that is. And stations should not just let it be swept under the rug. They really need to pay attention because even on a small scale where it's not ransom, it can disrupt your programming and cause you embarrassment. And as the guy that told me that his RDS got hacked into, he was worried about lawsuits from some things that were going out on the RDS and he got it shut down. So Wayne, I really appreciate your time today and appreciate you being with us.
Yep. Thank you for certainly my pleasure to be here. Let me make one last
Sure.
maybe plug. I earlier had mentioned the FCC cybersecurity workshops that were held in May. Actually, there were two of them. The first one was focused on the broadcast industry. The second one, which was the next day, was focused on the wireless carrier. But those are available on the FCC website. I think a Google search on FCC cybersecurity workshop will take you to their page where all of that workshops are available, the handouts and so forth. So that might be something of interest. There's about, oh, I don't know, four, maybe 5 hours worth of content uh, that was there. And of course, the first hour is the best since it was me on the broadcast one.
That's right. Well, thanks again, Wayne. I'll remind everybody
Thanks,
that
Wayne.
joined us to join us for our normal monthly engineering webinar, which will be coming up Tuesday, June 16th. And our special guest on that program will be Frank Foti, Mr. Omnia, and he's going to talk about how we got to where we are today in audio processing. So that will be on June 16th at the same time. So thanks everybody for joining, and we'll see you on June 16th. Thanks everyone.